Every morning at exactly 5:30 a.m., Ethan Carter stepped out of his aging apartment building on the outskirts of Queens, coffee in one hand, car keys in the other. The hallway lights flickered like they always did, and the elevator was still broken. Again. He didn't complain. He never did. At 41, Ethan had the kind of calm, worn-in face that came from years of quiet endurance. His movements were steady, deliberate. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted. He drove for a living, private chauffeur work for people whose lives ran on schedules tighter than their smiles. To them, he was just another uniform behind the wheel. Reliable, replaceable, invisible. By day, Ethan navigated Manhattan traffic in luxury sedans, worth more than his yearly income. He memorized routes, anticipated moods, stayed silent unless spoken to. He learned quickly that silence was safer. Silence kept questions away. By night, he was something else entirely. At 7:15 p.m., Ethan became dad. His daughter Lily, 8 years old, waited for him every evening by the small kitchen table. Homework spread out, sneakers kicked off, hair pulled into a messy ponytail. Their apartment was modest, faded paint, second-hand furniture, thin walls, but it was warm in the ways that mattered. Ethan cooked simple meals, grilled cheese, pasta, chicken soup when Lily had a cold. They ate together, always. Lily talked. Ethan listened. He helped her with math, read her stories before bed, and stayed up late fixing things he couldn't afford to replace. When she slept, curled up with her stuffed bear, Ethan sat on the edge of her bed longer than necessary, watching her breathe, making sure she was safe, making sure he was enough. No one in his professional world knew about Lily, and no one knew who Ethan Carter used to be. 4 years earlier, he had arrived in New York with one suitcase, a broken heart, and a single promise: to protect his daughter from a world that measured worth in money and power. He chose anonymity on purpose, a smaller life, a quieter life. And so he drove, and he waited, unaware that the silence he had built so carefully was about to be shattered by an invitation that was never meant to be kind. To Victoria Reynolds, the back seat of her car was a throne. She never noticed the streets they passed, never cared who sat behind the wheel. Her world existed in phone calls, calendar alerts, and the constant low hum of power. At 36, Victoria had inherited more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. And somehow it had only made her sharper, colder, more impatient. Ethan had been driving her for nearly 4 years. In that time, she had asked him exactly 2 personal questions. Both were complaints disguised as instructions. Why are we late? Why is it so quiet in here? Ethan answered the first with facts. The second was silence. Victoria didn't like silence. It reminded her that other people existed. She treated staff the way she treated furniture: useful, interchangeable, and beneath emotional consideration. Drivers, assistants, servers, cleaners. They all blurred together. To her, respect was reserved for those who could offer something in return. Ethan learned her moods quickly. The clipped tone when deals went wrong. The sharp exhale when traffic slowed. The cold satisfaction when she dismissed someone with a single sentence. He absorbed it all without reacting, his expression calm, his hands steady on the wheel. From the back seat, Victoria never saw the man. She didn't see the discipline in the way he drove, the restraint in the way he spoke, the quiet intelligence in the way he listened. To her, Ethan was just the driver, and that was exactly how she liked it. One afternoon, as they pulled up to a luxury restaurant in Midtown, Victoria laughed with her friends over speakerphone, joking about the upcoming charity gala, about the guests, the outfits, the spectacle of it all. Honestly, she said, smirking, it's basically entertainment for people like us. Ethan said nothing, but his grip tightened just slightly, because he knew something she didn't. Sometimes the people you overlook the most are the ones who see you most clearly. And sometimes arrogance plants the seeds of its own humiliation, long before anyone realizes what's coming. When Ethan Carter shut the apartment door behind him each night, the weight of the day finally loosened its grip. The city noise faded into the background as he kicked off his work shoes and rolled up his sleeves. The air inside the apartment smelled like laundry detergent and whatever Lily had tried to cook for herself before he got home. Usually toast, occasionally disaster. "Dad, you're late," Lily called from the kitchen, not upset, just stating a fact, the way kids do. "Traffic," Ethan said, smiling. "The usual enemy." Their evenings followed a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Homework at the small table by the window. Dinner cooked side by side. Ethan moved with quiet efficiency, patient and focused, letting Lily talk through every thought that crossed her mind. School drama. A classmate who cheated on a spelling test. A teacher who smelled like coffee. He listened the way he did everything, fully. Money was tight, but the apartment never felt empty. Ethan fixed broken chairs instead of replacing them, patched things instead of throwing them away. He taught Lily how to rinse dishes properly, how to fold clothes, how to say thank you and mean it. Small lessons, real ones. Some nights after Lily fell asleep, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table with a stack of unpaid bills and an old photo tucked between them. A younger version of himself, a different life. He didn't look at it for long. That life had cost him too much. He chose this one instead. Ethan never talked about the future in grand terms. No promises of luxury. No talk of someday. He believed in showing up, in consistency, in being the kind of father Lily could depend on, even if the world never noticed. And that was the irony. By day, he was invisible to people who thought they mattered most. By night, he was everything to someone who mattered more than anything else. Ethan didn't know it yet, but the quiet world he had built so carefully for his daughter was about to be disturbed. Not by danger, not by poverty, but by the very people who had never bothered to see him at all. The idea came to Victoria Reynolds the way most of her ideas did, casually, carelessly, and without a second thought for consequences. She was seated at a long marble table in a private dining room overlooking Central Park, surrounded by women who looked just like her. Polished, wealthy, effortlessly bored. Champagne flowed. Laughter echoed. Someone complained about a fundraiser being too crowded last year, as if generosity were an inconvenience. That charity gala is coming up again, one of them said. Same people, same speeches, same fake smiles. Victoria smirked. Honestly, it's also predictable. Her eyes drifted to the window, then, briefly, to the driver waiting outside below. Ethan Carter, standing still, patient, invisible. What if we mix things up? Victoria said slowly, a spark lighting behind her eyes. What if we invited someone unexpected? Her friends leaned in. My driver, she added, amused. I mean, can you imagine? Put him in a room full of people who actually belong there. The table erupted in laughter. He wouldn't even know what fork to use, someone joked. Or what to wear, another said. Victoria's smile sharpened. Exactly. The invitation was printed that same afternoon. Thick ivory paper, gold lettering, her name embossed at the top. Formal, legitimate, indistinguishable from any other guests. When Victoria handed it to Ethan the next morning, she barely looked at him. You're invited to the gala, she said flatly. Dress appropriately. Ethan took the envelope without comment. Yes, ma'am. He waited until he was alone before opening it. The words stared back at him, cold, elegant, intentional. For a moment he felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not fear, not anger. Recognition. Victoria thought this was a joke, a harmless game, a way to remind someone of his place. What she didn't know, what she could never have imagined, was that the invitation she meant to use for humiliation had just reopened a door Ethan had kept locked for 4 long years. And once opened, it wouldn't be so easy to close again. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep with a paperback still open on her chest, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table and turned the invitation over in his hands. Ivory paper, gold trim, his name printed clean and precise. It felt unreal. He hadn't been to a formal event in years. Not since before the world he knew had collapsed in on itself. Not since grief had stripped everything down to its bare essentials. Ethan opened the small storage box he kept on the top shelf of the closet. One Lily had never touched because he'd quietly taught her that some things didn't need explaining yet. Inside were documents, old photos, and one carefully folded suit wrapped in dry cleaner plastic. Dark, timeless, untouched. He ran his fingers along the fabric, memories pressing in despite his efforts to keep them buried. There was a time when rooms like that, Gala Ballroom, had known his footsteps, when his last name carried weight, when people smiled too eagerly and listened too closely. He had learned early how empty that attention could feel, how loud money was, and how quiet grief became when it arrived uninvited. The night his wife died, the world stopped making sense. The day he buried his parents, it stopped asking permission. Lily had been barely 3 years old when he made his decision. He sold what needed selling, signed what needed signing, left instructions with people he trusted. Then he walked away from a life most people would kill to have, not out of weakness, but out of clarity. He didn't want Lily raised by strangers in tailored suits. He didn't want her believing that worth came from numbers on a screen. So he became no one. A driver, a renter, a man without a past. Ethan folded the invitation and set it down carefully. Victoria thought this was a joke, a performance, a moment of entertainment. But for Ethan, it was something else entirely. It was a reminder that the life he'd hidden wasn't gone. And a question he'd been avoiding for 4 years quietly formed in his mind. How long could he protect his daughter from the truth before the truth found them both? Ethan didn't decide that night. He lay awake long after Lily's breathing settled into its steady rhythm, staring at the ceiling as the city hummed beyond the thin walls. The invitation sat on the kitchen counter like a quiet challenge. Not demanding, just waiting. Morning came too fast. He packed Lily's lunch, tied her shoelaces, and walked her to the bus stop like always. She chatted about a science project and a classmate's new puppy. Ethan nodded, smiled, filed every detail away the way he did with everything that mattered. "Dad," Lily said suddenly, looking up at him, "do you ever get scared?" The question caught him off guard. "Sometimes," he answered honestly. "But being scared doesn't mean you stop doing the right thing." She seemed to think about that, then hugged him quickly before running onto the bus. That afternoon, Ethan called in sick for the first time in 4 years. He took the suit from the closet and brought it to a tailor downtown. Someone old school, quiet, respectful. No questions asked, just careful hands and a knowing nod. When Ethan tried it on, the man stepped back, surprised. "Fits like it remembers you," he said. Ethan almost smiled. As evening fell, Ethan stood alone in the apartment, adjusting his cuffs in the mirror. The man looking back at him seemed familiar and distant at the same time. Older, wiser, still carrying weight, but standing straighter now. This wasn't about Victoria. It wasn't about pride. And it sure as hell wasn't about revenge. It was about Lily. Someday, she would ask where she came from, who her father really was. Ethan wanted to be able to answer without shame or fear. He knelt by Lily's bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered a promise she wouldn't hear. "I'll always come back." Then Ethan Carter picked up his keys and walked out the door. Not as a driver following orders, but as a man choosing to face a life he had once set down. The gala wasn't going to change who he was, but it was about to remind everyone else. The charity gala filled the downtown ballroom with light, glass, and polished smiles. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, reflecting off black tuxedos and designer gowns that cost more than most people's rent. Laughter moved easily through the room, loud, confident, careless. At the entrance, cars arrived in a steady rhythm. Then one of them stopped the rhythm completely. The doors opened, and Ethan Carter stepped out. Not the driver people were used to ignoring. Not the man behind the wheel. This version of Ethan moved with quiet confidence. Shoulders squared, expression calm, but unmistakably present. The tailored suit fit him effortlessly, like it had been waiting for this moment. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He simply walked forward. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. A few guests paused mid-sentence, unsure why their attention had shifted. Something about him felt different, grounded, composed, unbothered by the weight of the room. Cameras lifted almost instinctively. Inside the ballroom, Victoria Reynolds was laughing with her friends when she noticed the sudden hush spreading outward like a ripple in water. "What's going on?" someone whispered. Victoria turned. At first, her mind refused to connect what her eyes were seeing. The man entering couldn't possibly be. Her smile froze. That was Ethan, not standing by the car, not waiting with the door open, but walking across the floor as if he belonged there. Because he did. The realization hit her in fragments. The posture, the calm, the way people stepped aside without being asked. For the first time in 4 years, Victoria actually looked at him. Ethan felt the shift immediately. He didn't search for reactions, didn't need to. The silence told him enough. With every step, the weight he'd carried for years seemed to lift, replaced by something steadier. Acceptance. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He wasn't there to make a point. He was there because he'd chosen to stop hiding. And as the doors closed behind him, one thing became clear to everyone watching. The man they thought they knew had never really existed at all. The silence didn't last long. It broke with the clear, practiced voice of the evening's host. A man who had spent decades navigating rooms like this, reading power the way others read weather. He stepped toward Ethan with a look that shifted from curiosity to recognition, then to disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host said, his voice carrying easily across the room, "forgive the interruption, but it's not often we're surprised like this." He extended his hand to Ethan. "Mr. Ethan Carter, it's an honor to finally welcome you back." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Ethan accepted the handshake, steady and composed. He didn't correct the man. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The host continued, carefully now, aware that every word mattered. He spoke of legacy, of a family name long associated with vineyards on the West Coast, with philanthropy that rarely sought attention, of a man who had stepped away from public life years ago, by choice. Heads turned, phones came out, whispers multiplied. Victoria felt the room tilt. "Back, welcome you back." The pieces slammed together too fast for her to stop them. The driver, the silence, the restraint, the way he never reacted, no matter how she spoke to him. It wasn't weakness. It was control. Across the ballroom, Ethan listened without expression, his gaze calm. He caught Victoria's eye just once. There was no accusation there, no triumph, only clarity, the kind that arrives too late to undo anything. Applause followed, hesitant at first, then building as understanding spread. People who hadn't known why they were impressed now felt justified in it. They leaned closer, smiled wider, adjusted their tone. Ethan felt none of it land the way it once might have, because the truth hadn't changed him. It had only revealed what had always been there. Quiet strength, carefully hidden, now standing in plain sight. And for Victoria Reynolds, standing frozen among her peers, one realization cut deeper than any embarrassment. She hadn't just misjudged a man. She had exposed herself. Ethan didn't seek her out. The conversation found him anyway, near the edge of the ballroom, where the music softened and the smiles thinned. Victoria stood there alone, champagne untouched in her hand, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. When she finally turned, Ethan was already beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. "I didn't know," Victoria said at last. Her voice was lower than usual, less certain. "If I had—" Ethan lifted a hand gently, not to silence her, but to slow the moment down. "It wouldn't have changed anything," he said. His tone was calm, measured. "You treated me the way you believed I deserved to be treated." The words landed quietly and cut cleanly. Victoria swallowed. She searched his face for anger, for satisfaction, for something she could argue against. There was nothing there, just composure, just truth. "I thought you were playing a role," she said, more to herself than to him. "So did you," Ethan replied. "We all do." He looked around the room, at the chandeliers, the suits, the practiced laughter. "I spent 4 years listening from the front seat. People talk freely when they think no one important is listening." Victoria flinched. "I learned a lot," he continued, "about power, about kindness, about who people are when they believe there's nothing to gain." She finally met his eyes. "What do you want from me?" Ethan shook his head once. "Nothing." That was the hardest part. "I came tonight because I have a daughter," he said, "and one day she'll ask me who I was before I was her dad. I wanted to be able to answer that honestly." He paused, then added softer now, "I hope someday you ask yourself the same question." Ethan stepped away before Victoria could respond. She stood there long after he was gone, the noise of the gala washing back in around her. The room felt unchanged. The people felt unchanged. But something in her wasn't. Because humiliation fades, what lingers is the moment you realize no one wronged you. You simply revealed yourself. The headlines the next morning were polite, almost careful. They spoke of generosity, of record-breaking donations, of a surprising guest whose return had stirred conversation. No one mentioned humiliation. No one needed to. In rooms where decisions were made quietly, over coffee, behind closed doors, names were reconsidered, invitations paused, phone calls went unanswered a little longer than usual. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle change in temperature. Victoria Reynolds felt it immediately. People were still cordial, still smiling, but the warmth was gone. Conversation stopped when she approached. Eyes lingered a second too long, then slid away. She had become inconvenient. Not because of what Ethan had revealed, but because of what she had revealed about herself. Power, she was learning, was not only about money. Ethan returned to his routine the following week. He drove the same streets, wore the same calm expression, but something had shifted for him too. People spoke to him differently now, more carefully, more respectfully. He noticed it, acknowledged it, and let it pass. The attention no longer pulled at him the way it once might have. At home, nothing changed. Lily still did her homework at the kitchen table, still asked for help with spelling, still laughed at jokes that weren't funny. Ethan cooked dinner, fixed a loose cabinet hinge, and listened. That night, as they washed dishes together, Lily glanced up at him. "You seem lighter," she said. Ethan paused, surprised. "Do I?" She nodded. "Like when you finally tell the truth about something." He smiled, not wide, not forced, just real. "Maybe," he said. Later, after Lily was asleep, Ethan stood by the window and watched the city move below. He hadn't won anything. He hadn't lost anything. But he had stopped hiding. And somewhere between the quiet consequences and the ordinary routines, Ethan understood something important. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it settles in, slow, steady, and impossible to ignore. The offer didn't come with fireworks. It arrived quietly. An email followed by a phone call, respectful in tone, precise in detail. People who once spoke in assumptions now spoke in questions. They wanted Ethan back, not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as a leader. Ethan listened. He didn't answer right away. That evening, he picked Lily up from school and took a longer route home, one that passed a small park where kids played until sunset. Lily ran ahead laughing, and Ethan watched her with the steady attention that had become second nature. Every decision he made began and ended there. At home, he cooked dinner and helped with homework as usual. Later, when Lily asked why he looked thoughtful, Ethan didn't dodge the question. "Sometime," he said, "you get a chance to choose again. And it's not about what you want, it's about what you want to stand for." Lily considered this. "Can choices be scary and good at the same time?" He smiled. "The best ones usually are." Over the next few weeks, Ethan prepared carefully. He set boundaries. He made conditions clear. If he stepped back into that world, it would be on his terms. Transparent, ethical, human. He would not trade presence for power again. And one condition mattered more than all the rest. His schedule would be his own. His daughter would come first. When the agreement was finalized, Ethan didn't celebrate. He packed Lily's lunch the next morning, walked her to the bus stop, and watched her wave from the steps like always. Life didn't need a reset, just an honest continuation. That night, Ethan opened the closet and took out the suit once more. Not for a gala this time, for a meeting that mattered. He wasn't returning to reclaim a throne. He was stepping forward to build something better, with his feet on the ground, his values intact, and his daughter watching. On a quiet Saturday morning, Ethan Carter drove north with the windows down, the city thinning into open sky. The road curved past fields and low fences, sunlight breaking through in clean, honest bands. In the passenger seat, Lily hummed to herself, shoes kicked off, a notebook balanced on her knees. They weren't in a hurry. Ethan liked it that way. The vineyard came into view slowly, rows of green stretching toward the hills, patient and grounded. This was where the past had once felt heavy. Now it felt different, not lighter exactly, truer. Ethan parked, cut the engine, and sat for a moment, listening to the wind move through the leaves. "Is this where you used to work?" Lily asked. "It's where I learned," he said, "about patience, about time." They walked together between the rows. Ethan didn't lecture. He pointed things out the way a father does. Soil, weather, the way care compounds quietly over years. Lily asked questions. He answered some and let others sit. Not everything needed certainty to be meaningful. Later, as they shared lunch on the tailgate, Lily looked at him with the serious curiosity only kids manage so effortlessly. "Dad," she said, "were you always this calm?" Ethan smiled, reflective. "No, I learned it. From loss, from silence, from choosing presence over pride." He thought about the gala, the chandeliers, the shock, the truth spoken aloud. He thought about how quickly noise fades and how slowly character endures. He thought about a world that measures success loudly and a life that proves value quietly. That evening, back home, Ethan tucked Lily in and sat at the edge of her bed, the way he always had. She reached for his hand. "I like who you are," she said simply. Ethan felt the words settle, deep and steady. After she slept, he stood by the window and watched the city glow. He didn't feel victorious. He felt aligned. The kind of alignment that doesn't need applause. So here's the question for you. How do you treat people when you believe they can't give you anything in return? Who are you when no one important is watching? And what would change if you chose to live just a little more honestly? Because life doesn't ask us to be impressive. It asks us to be decent, and sometimes brave enough to stop hiding. If this story made you pause, if it reminded you that worth isn't worn on a sleeve or printed on a balance sheet, then you already understand what matters. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Stories about quiet strength, hard choices, and the kind of justice that doesn't shout but lasts. And if you're still here at the end, leave a comment. What part of the story stayed with you the most? We'll be here, listening.